When it comes to legendary bromances, it's hard to beat the one between Bucky Barnes and Steve Rogers. These two have gone through hell and high water together, and their relationship notoriously put a strain on the one between Steve Rogers and Tony Stark. But there's a lot more to Bucky's character than just being Steve's BFF. And today, we're gonna talk about some things you may not have realized about the Winter Soldier. Now that the Avengers are in the endgame, it seems like forever ago since we were first heading to theaters to see Captain America: The First Avenger. Captain America is a superhero who's beloved by many, and even people who don't read comic books knew who he was prior to the movie being released in 2011. There's no denying the appeal of Captain America, and it's easy to see why so many people only saw the character of Bucky Barnes as a means to establish Steve Rogers as a likable and relatable guy. But Bucky is an interesting person in his own right, both in the comic books and on the big screen. Today, we're going to be talking about some things you may not have realized about his appearance in the MCU, and what we can learn from the comic book version of his character. It sounds weird to say that another character is better than Steve Rogers, but that's really how Bucky got his start in the MCU. These two have been pals since way back when Bucky was always the overachiever between the two of them. He literally stood up for Steve when he was getting bullied at one point, and when Steve's parents died and he had no place to go, Bucky insisted he come stay with him. When Steve protested that he could get by on his own, Bucky said, "The thing is, you don't have to. I'm with you to the end of the line, pal." Seriously, in addition to being superheroes, these guys are total friendship goals. Despite being an incredible soldier himself, Bucky tried his best to deter Steve from joining the army out of desperation to keep his friend safe. As we all know, Bucky was really the one who could have used some protection out there. He fell into the hands of Hydra and ended up being heavily experimented on by Arnim Zola. We'll get back to that in a bit, but we want to talk about a man who was integral to the eventual rescue of Bucky, and this time we aren't talking about Steve Rogers. Although he was long gone by the time Iron Man hit theaters in 2008, Howard Stark is a hugely important character in the MCU. Of course, he's the father of the infamous Tony Stark, but he's so much more than that. Howard was a brilliant inventor and businessman, and even displayed a prototype for a flying car during the Stark Expo, which took place during Captain America: The First Avenger. If that's not a sign of true forward thinking, we just don't know what is. His contributions to the technology and events in the MCU are numerous, but he personally affected the lives of both Steve and Bucky in huge ways. Along with Peggy Carter, he participated in the rescue of Dr. Abraham Erskine, the person who invented the super soldier serum, which turned Steve into Captain America in the first place. When it came time to rescue Bucky from the clutches of Hydra, Howard personally piloted Steve behind enemy lines in order to rescue him. While Bucky was, of course, thankful to Steve for rescuing him, an interesting shift had occurred in their long-established dynamic. For their entire lives up until this point, Bucky had been the gracious winner, and was used to being on a specific side in the disparity in their strengths. Now he was forced to cope with the fact that Steve was now Captain America, capable of bending steel bars and other acts of positively inhuman strength. With all of the craziness of the war, the forces of evil, and the surprising new technology, it's easy to lose focus on how the dynamic between these two drastically changed. Bucky also had to see how effortlessly attractive Steve had become to women, which was also a huge role reversal. In fact, we think it's something that few mortal pals would be able to deal with, at least as graciously as these two. When it came time to fight together, Bucky told Steve he wasn't following Captain America, but he would follow his friend Steve anywhere. Sadly, their final battle together didn't end well, and Steve believed he had seen the last of Bucky when he crashed into the icy Danube River. As we all know, Bucky did survive, but things would get a lot worse for him before they got better. Howard Stark and Peggy Carter had founded S.H.I.E.L.D. and decided to take on some Nazi scientists who claimed to have repented. Most notably among them was Arnim Zola. While hiding in plain sight, he was able to recreate Hydra within the parameters of S.H.I.E.L.D., with Howard Stark being none the wiser. One of Arnim's many misdeeds was the Winter Soldier Project, which involved creating a powerful and emotionless assassin. While Bucky was first in the possession of Hydra, prior to being rescued by Captain America, he was experimented upon, which left him physiologically superior to your average human. This made him the ideal Winter Soldier, especially after getting a new arm and no shortage of mind control. He was used as an assassin, had his memory consistently wiped, and was kept in a state of suspended animation when his talents weren't being utilized. While the Winter Soldier is an appealing name, it's so much more than that. The Winter Soldier investigation was an actual historical event, which not too many people realize. It was sponsored by a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and its aim was to publicize war crimes by the United States Armed Forces and their allies, which occurred during the Vietnam War. It called into question the morality of atrocities committed during war times and under orders. It's easy to see why this was such a fitting and foreboding choice to call what Bucky had transformed into. Does the fact that Bucky was under the control of an evil organization absolve him of his crimes? Who's even the judge of that anyway? Now, we all know that during his time as the Winter Soldier, Bucky killed Tony's parents, Howard and Maria Stark. To make the situation even sadder, it was just following a heated argument between Tony and his father, after which Howard left to deliver the new form of the Super Soldier Serum. He was then run off the road by the Winter Soldier and pleaded with him to spare his wife's life. As far as Bucky was concerned, Howard was a stranger who he had no memory of, but Howard absolutely recognized Bucky as someone he had served with during the war, making this incident even more tragic. He was then brutally beaten by a man who he had once helped rescue, and Tony was left without parents. Considering the past, the strength of their friendship, and what they had already endured, it's honestly not surprising that Steve Rogers refused to turn against Bucky, despite all that had happened. Even when he learned that Bucky had killed their former colleague and his friend Tony's parents, he stood by him. Obviously, their friendship is a huge reason for this, but we think it goes even deeper than that. Captain America: Civil War was a great film, but it was also an emotionally fraught one. Not only did Tony learn the truth about what happened to his parents, but he found out that Steve had been aware of it for quite some time, and had even protected his parents' killer. But while Tony's emotional pain was plain to see, the Winter Soldier had clearly impacted Steve as well. Knowing that your pal had become a mindless assassin is one thing, but Steve had to watch him kill a man who had been their ally during a time of war. Sure, it's not the same as seeing your parents get killed, but the emotional impact it had on Steve shouldn't be glossed over. His decision to stand by Bucky wasn't as simple as just looking out for an old friend or choosing Bucky over Tony. While Captain America and the Winter Soldier were mostly unconscious following the events of Captain America: The First Avenger, Howard Stark wasn't. He had to live with what happened all of this time, and it's clear that he didn't forget either of these soldiers. It was said that after Captain America disappeared, Howard was one of the people who insisted they keep looking for him, and that he must still be out there somewhere. Now, we're not saying Howard Stark has never done bad things, or that he's a perfect person. He's undergone many changes and made some questionable choices, like most interesting characters in the MCU, but there's no denying that many of his actions have had a positive impact on the MCU, or that he was impacted by the time he spent with Bucky and Steve. Remember back in Captain America: The First Avenger when Steve first took the Super Soldier Serum? He wanted to be fighting on the front lines with Bucky, but it seemed like the government just wanted to use him as propaganda. They just wanted him to act like a soldier instead of being one. And this didn't sit right with Steve, who's always been committed to doing what he thinks is right. In many ways, what happened to Bucky was truly Steve's worst fear. The Winter Soldier was a completely mindless pawn, being used as a tool by an organization he had no choice but to obey. When the Sokovia Accords were proposed during Civil War, they seemed like the embodiment of everything Steve feared because of what happened to Bucky. The government was fighting for more control, and the thought was more than just unpleasant for Steve. It was downright terrifying. During Captain America: The Winter Soldier, we saw Steve being pushed to his limits already when asked to work for S.H.I.E.L.D. Although Nick Fury initially tells Steve he doesn't want him to feel uncomfortable with his actions, he eventually tells him to get with the program. When Steve and Bucky first started fighting, they were going to battle against the Nazis, the one group of people we can all agree are irredeemably evil. What was right and wrong, who were the good and the bad guys, were all really easy to see. But after waking up in a completely new time period, all of this was much harder for Steve to figure out. Instead of spending time questioning what he's doing, Nick Fury encourages Steve to be more like his fellow operative, Black Widow, who follows orders completely. By the end of the movie, we saw Steve battling with the age-old question of freedom versus security. He had to choose between trying to quietly dismantle Hydra or tearing down the organization which made it possible for such evil to flourish in the first place. The fact that his beloved Bucky is involved makes the fight even more personal to Steve, and at the end, he decides that he can't trade the life of Bucky for anything. Once Captain America decides something, it's exceptionally rare for him to change his mind, and in fact, the "we don't trade lives" mantra is carried over to Infinity War years later. At the end of The Winter Soldier, we see Bucky pulling Steve from a river. Seriously, what is with these guys and falling into rivers? The Winter Soldier on its own is a decent entry in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but when put into context, it's surprisingly essential to setting up Captain America's motives during Civil War. Everyone knows that Steve has always struggled making peace with the time skip he experienced in his life, and we know that Bucky represents an important link to his past. In addition to representing a safe place to Steve, he also represents Steve's fears, and the battles we see him fighting with Bucky are the ones raging inside his own mind. After seeking refuge in Wakanda, Bucky became known as the White Wolf, which we learn while we see him staring over a river and presumably hoping he doesn't fall into it. But in the comic books, he holds yet another title, and surprisingly, it's none other than Captain America. Yes, Bucky Barnes is one of the characters other than Steve Rogers who has taken on the mantle of Captain America. Many fans believe that Steve Rogers isn't going to survive the events of Avengers Endgame, and wonder if Bucky may take on the role of Captain America in his place. However, we have to say we're skeptical. For one thing, the Bucky in the comics is pretty different from the one in the MCU, and had spent a lot of time running around in a costume as Steve's sidekick. Then there's the fact that a huge theme here is that Captain America's having trouble finding his place in the world as it exists today. More and more, it seems like the world doesn't want the old Captain America, and the feeling is mutual. While there are characters such as Captain Marvel who we think could help serve the steadfastly moral person guidance role Steve has fulfilled, it seems as though simply making a new Captain America wouldn't really fit, given all that's gone down in the MCU. That being said, we do think Bucky Barnes will have a say in the future of the MCU. What do you think about the importance of Bucky Barnes in the MCU? Do you think he'll become the new Captain America, or will he have another important part to play? Let us know what you think in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to CBR for more MCU content. Thanks for watching.